Have you ever stood at the edge of a place so old it feels like it's breathing? A place where the water holds secrets deeper than any man can measure. Imagine yourself there, at Cado Lake, in the year 1927. The world was changing fast, with new machines and new ideas. But in this corner of Texas, time moved differently. It moved with the slow, patient rhythm of the water and the cypress trees. The air itself seemed thick with stories, with memories of things long past. This is a story about a day when the lake decided to keep a secret that would echo through the years, never quite fading away. The people of Potter's Point knew the lake better than anyone. They were born by its shores and expected to be buried in the soil nearby. They understood its moods, from the gentle morning mists to the sudden violent storms. They knew which channels were safe and which ones could lead a boat into a tangled maze of roots and shadows. But do we ever truly know a place like Cado Lake? Can we ever be sure what lies beneath the dark, still surface of the water? This is a question the folks in Potter's Point would soon ask themselves, over and over, for the rest of their lives. This story is about 6 men. They were husbands, fathers, and friends. They were a part of the small community that called this wild place home. Like their fathers before them, they went out on the water to provide for their families. It was a simple life, guided by the sun and the seasons. They thought they understood the risks. They worried about storms, about getting lost, or about the large alligators that drifted like logs in the water. But they never imagined a danger they couldn't see. They never imagined a day they would simply vanish into the heart of the lake. So, come back with me to that time. Let the noise of the modern world fall away. Listen to the gentle lap of water against a wooden boat. Feel the humid air on your skin. We are going to a place where a mystery was born, a mystery that began on a perfectly ordinary morning. It was a day that started with the promise of a good catch, but ended with a silence that could not be explained. It was the day the lake took 6 men and offered no answers in return, leaving only questions that still hang in the air like the Spanish moss. Potter's Point wasn't much of a town. It was more like a collection of families clinging to the edge of the vast lake. The year was 1927, and life here was simple and hard. There were no paved roads leading to their homes. There were only dirt tracks that turned to mud in the rain and narrow channels of water that served as streets. The houses themselves stood on tall wooden stilts. They were built to stay above the water when the lake decided to rise. This was a place where nature was in charge, and people had learned to live with that fact, not against it. The community was small and isolated. Everyone knew everyone else's business. They celebrated births together and mourned deaths together. They shared their food when fishing was good and helped rebuild when a storm tore a roof from a house. Children played on the wooden walkways that connected the homes, their laughter echoing over the water. The women gathered to mend nets and prepare food, their conversations a constant, comforting hum. It was a close-knit world, held together by shared work, shared faith, and a shared reliance on the great, mysterious lake that gave them everything and could take it all away. Life moved at a slow pace, dictated by the natural world. The morning started before the sun, with the sounds of roosters and the creak of wooden boats being pushed into the water. The day was spent working, fishing, or tending to small gardens on any patch of solid ground they could find. The evening brought the families back together. They would sit on their porches, watching the sun set behind the cypress trees, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The night was filled with the sounds of crickets, frogs, and the occasional splash of something large moving in the dark water below. This isolation made them strong, but it also made them vulnerable. They were far from the law and modern medicine. If trouble came, they had to rely on each other. They had faced floods, fevers, and lean times. They had always managed to get through. They believed they were prepared for anything the lake could throw at them. But the trouble that was coming was different. It was a quiet, creeping kind of trouble. It wouldn't arrive with the roar of a storm, but with the deafening silence of 6 empty chairs at 6 dinner tables. The 6 men were the heart of Potter's Point. There was Old Man Hemlock, the unofficial leader. He had fished this lake for 50 years and knew its secrets better than his own reflection. Then there were the Miller brothers, John and Abe. They were strong and quiet, always working together. Their movements in the boat, a silent, practiced dance. Young Billy Croft was there too. He was barely a man, eager to prove himself and full of nervous energy. And finally, there were Samuel and Peter, two cousins who argued like brothers but were never seen apart. They were the muscle and the laughter of the group. Their routine was as old as the community itself. Long before the first light of dawn, they would gather at the main dock. They would share a cup of hot black coffee, their voices low and soft in the pre-dawn quiet. They would talk about the weather, the water levels, and where the fish might be biting. Their conversation was simple and practical. There was a comfort in this routine, a sense of order in a world that could be chaotic and untamed. On this particular morning, nothing seemed different. The air was cool and still, promising a calm day on the water. They planned to head towards Goat Island. It was a remote part of the lake, known for its deep waters and big catfish. It was a longer journey than usual, but the promise of a big haul was worth the effort. They loaded their 3 small boats, called pirogues, with nets, tackle boxes, and lunch pails packed by their wives. They moved with the easy, unhurried efficiency of men who had done this 1,000 times before. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting a golden glow on the water, they pushed off from the shore, their paddles dipping in near-perfect sync. The women and children stood on the porches of their stilted homes to watch them go. It was a familiar sight. They waved until the boats were just small specks in the distance, swallowed by the vastness of the lake and the towering cypress trees. The men's departure marked the true beginning of the day. The gentle sound of their paddles faded, replaced by the waking sounds of the swamp. No one had any reason to think this day would be any different from the hundreds of days that had come before it. It was just another morning, and the men were going to work. The sun climbed high in the sky, beating down on the tin roofs of Potter's Point. The day passed as it always did. The women tended to their chores, the children played their games, and the hours slowly ticked by. As the afternoon began to fade, a sense of anticipation started to build. This was the time of day when the women would start to look towards the lake, watching for the first sign of the returning boats. Usually they would appear as the sun began to touch the tops of the cypress trees, their familiar shapes gliding out of the haze. But on this day, the sun dipped lower and lower, and the lake remained empty. The usual path the men took was clear and still. There was no sign of their boats, no distant sound of their voices carrying over the water. The women tried to stay busy, telling themselves that the fishing must be good. Perhaps the men had decided to stay out a little longer to fill their nets. It was a reasonable thought, a hopeful thought. But as the sky turned from orange to a deep, bruised purple, a small knot of worry began to tighten in their chests. Darkness fell quickly, as it always does on the lake. The familiar, comforting sounds of the evening were there, the chorus of frogs, the buzz of insects. But tonight, they seemed different. They seemed to mock the growing silence from the water. The women lit the lanterns on their porches, their yellow light creating small islands of hope in the overwhelming darkness. They called to each other from their homes, their voices filled with a question they were afraid to ask out loud. Where were they? Why weren't they back yet? The children were put to bed, their usual bedtime stories replaced with quiet prayers. The women gathered on one of the main docks, their faces pale in the lantern light. Every snap of a twig, every splash in the water, made them jump. They strained their ears, listening for the sound of paddles, for the familiar calls of their husbands, but the only sound was the deep, ancient breathing of the swamp. The worry that had started as a small knot was now a cold, heavy stone of fear in their stomachs. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. The men of Potter's Point who had stayed behind could not ignore the women's fear. It was a fear that was now spreading through the entire community. By midnight, it was decided that a search party had to go out. It was a dangerous choice. Navigating Cado Lake at night was treacherous even for those who knew it well. The maze of channels and submerged cypress stumps could easily trap a boat or tear a hole in its hull. But the thought of the 6 men, their friends and neighbors, being out there in trouble was a greater danger. They couldn't just wait until morning. A handful of the remaining men gathered their lanterns and their courage. Their boats were small, and the light from their lamps barely pushed back the suffocating darkness. The night was moonless, and the black water reflected the stars, making it impossible to tell where the lake ended and the sky began. The air was heavy and still. The usual night sounds of the swamp seemed to have quieted, as if the lake itself was holding its breath. The searchers called out the names of the missing men, their voices sounding small and thin against the vast, silent wilderness. They followed the route the men would have taken towards Goat Island. The journey was slow and filled with tension. Every shadow seemed to take the shape of an overturned boat. Every log floating in the water looked for a terrifying moment like a body. The men in the search party didn't speak much. They were focused on their task, their eyes scanning the dark water, their ears straining for any sound that was out of place. The lantern light danced across the Spanish moss hanging from the trees, creating ghostly, shifting shapes that played tricks on their tired eyes. As they got closer to the island, a strange feeling settled over them. It was a profound and unsettling stillness. The water here was like black glass. They called out the names again. Hemlock, John, Abe. The only answer was the echo of their own voices, which seemed to be swallowed by the night before it could travel far. They had searched for hours, and the darkness had offered no clues. There was no sign of a struggle, no debris, no sound of anyone calling for help. There was only the lake, the darkness, and the growing certainty that they were searching for something that was no longer there. When the first light of dawn finally broke, the search party found them. Not the men, but their boats. The 3 small pirogues were clustered together in a quiet cove near Goat Island, nudged gently against a thicket of cypress knees. From a distance, everything looked normal. The boats were upright and seemed undamaged. A wave of relief washed over the searchers. Maybe, just maybe, the men had simply pulled ashore on the island for the night. Maybe they were waiting there, safe and sound, ready to explain what had happened. But as the search party got closer, the relief turned to a deep and chilling confusion. The boats were completely empty. There was no sign of a struggle, no sign of panic. The fishing nets were neatly folded in the bottom of one boat. The tackle boxes were closed. The lunch pails, still containing uneaten food, sat undisturbed. A half-smoked pipe belonging to Old Man Hemlock lay on one of the wooden seats, as if he had just set it down for a moment. It was a perfectly normal scene, except for one impossible fact. The men were gone. It was as if they had been lifted straight out of their boats, vanishing into thin air without a sound. The searchers circled the boats, their minds racing to find an explanation. An accident? But the boats were fine. A fight? But there were no signs of violence, no overturned equipment. Did they all fall into the water at once? It seemed impossible. These were experienced men. They knew the water. They respected its dangers. The scene made no sense. It was a puzzle with all the pieces laid out, but they formed a picture of something that simply could not have happened. The quietness of the scene was the most terrifying part of all. Then they noticed the alligators. There were more of them than usual, circling slowly in the deeper water just beyond the cove. This was not entirely unusual, as alligators were a common sight, but their behavior was strange. They weren't aggressive. They weren't interested in the boats. They simply swam in slow, patient circles, their eyes just above the surface, watching. It felt less like a gathering of predators and more like a silent, unnerving vigil. The sight of them added another layer of dread to the mystery, another question that had no immediate or logical answer. In the days that followed, the search continued. Men came from nearby towns to help, combing every inch of the lake and the surrounding swamps. They dragged the waters around Goat Island, hoping to find a clue, a body, anything that would provide an answer. But they found nothing. The lake kept its secret. Back in Potter's Point, the silence of grief was soon filled with the sound of whispers. With no clear explanation, people began to create their own. The mystery was a vacuum, and human nature rushed to fill it with stories. Some folks believed the men had run into bootleggers. The wild, twisting channels of Cado Lake were a perfect place to hide illegal liquor operations during Prohibition. Maybe the 6 fishermen had stumbled upon a hidden still. Maybe they had seen something they weren't supposed to see. In this version of the story, the men were murdered and their bodies hidden, their boats left behind to make it look like an accident. It was a violent and ugly thought, but for some, it was more comforting than having no explanation at all. It was a human evil, something they could almost understand. Others whispered a different kind of story. They talked about the men running away. Times were hard. Maybe they had grown tired of the struggle, of the endless work for little reward. Maybe they had saved up a little money and simply rowed away to start new lives somewhere else. This rumor was mostly spoken by outsiders. The wives and families of the missing men refused to believe it. These were not men who would abandon their families. They were rooted to this place, to their homes and their children. The idea was an insult to their memory. And then there were the oldest stories, the ones whispered by the elders. These stories were not about criminals or runaway husbands. They were about the lake itself. Folks said Cado Lake had an ancient spirit, a powerful force that sometimes grew angry. They spoke of strange lights seen dancing over the water at night, and of a low humming sound that sometimes rose from the deepest parts of the lake. They believed the men had disturbed something, some old and sacred place, and the lake had simply taken them. It was a supernatural explanation, a story born from fear and a deep respect for the wild power of the place they called home. As the weeks turned into months, the official search was called off. The 6 men were declared lost, presumed dead. But for their wives, the mystery was a wound that would not close. As they sorted through their husbands' belongings, trying to find some order in their shattered lives, they began to notice small, strange details. Things they hadn't paid much attention to before the disappearance now seemed like important clues. They remembered that in the weeks leading up to that final fishing trip, the men had not been themselves. There was a quiet anxiety that seemed to hang over them. Billy Croft's young wife remembered that he had been having nightmares. He would wake up in a cold sweat, but he refused to talk about what he had dreamed. He would just hold her and stare into the darkness, listening to the sounds of the lake. The Miller brothers, usually so calm and steady, had been seen arguing in low, tense voices. And Old Man Hemlock, a man who feared nothing, had started carrying a small worn Bible with him in the boat. He had never been a particularly religious man before. These were small things, but when put together, they painted a picture of men who were deeply troubled by something. The most puzzling detail came from Samuel's wife. She recalled a secret meeting that had taken place just 2 nights before the men vanished. A traveling preacher, a man no one in Potter's Point knew, had come to their house after dark. He had met with all 6 of the fishermen. They had talked for hours in the main room, their voices too low for her to hear what was being said. When the preacher finally left, his face was pale and grim. The fisherman seemed even more anxious than before. She had asked her husband what it was about, but he had just shaken his head and told her it was better if she didn't know. What did they talk about with that mysterious preacher? What secrets were they keeping? Did their nightmares, their arguments, and their sudden interest in religion have something to do with what happened to them? These questions added a new, frustrating layer to the mystery. The possibility of bootleggers or an accident seemed too simple now. The evidence pointed to something more personal, something that the men knew was coming. It suggested they were not taken by surprise. Instead, it seemed they had gone out on the lake that morning to confront something that terrified them. Today is December 21st, 2025. Nearly a century has passed since that morning at Cado Lake. Potter's Point is gone now, its stilt houses long since rotted away and reclaimed by the swamp. The children of the community grew up and moved away, taking their parents' stories with them. The mystery of the 6 lost fishermen has faded from living memory into local legend. It has become just one more ghost story told around campfires, another whisper carried on the wind through the Spanish moss. But the questions remain, unanswered and unsettling. What really happened to those 6 men? Were they the victims of a terrible crime, silenced by bootleggers to protect a secret operation? Did they stage their own disappearance, rowing away towards a new life and leaving a mystery behind them? Or did they encounter something else out on the dark water, something ancient and unknowable, a force that the old stories tried to warn them about? Did their secret meeting with the preacher hold the key? Were they trying to fight some darkness they had uncovered, a darkness that ultimately consumed them? The truth, whatever it may be, was taken by the lake. It lies buried beneath the still black water, along with the secrets the 6 men carried with them on their final journey. The empty boats, the undisturbed belongings, and the circling alligators are the only facts we have. They create a picture that makes no logical sense, inviting us to fill in the gaps with our own fears and imagination. The story has no neat conclusion. There is no final chapter where a detective solves the case and explains everything away. There is only the silence, and so we are left to wonder. We can imagine ourselves on that dock, watching the sky turn from purple to black, feeling that cold knot of fear grow. We can try to piece together the clues, the nightmares, the arguments, the secret meeting, but in the end, we are left where the families of Potter's Point were left, standing at the edge of the water, staring into a mystery that is as deep and as dark as the lake itself. The silence that fell over the community that day has never truly been broken. It has simply spread out over the years, a quiet, permanent echo of an unanswered question.